I heard the bang before I saw anything. It was the unmistakable metallic clank of my garage door closing hard. I bolted out of my recliner, coffee sloshing onto my flannel pajama pants, and sprinted out the front door. "Hey, what the hell do you think you're doing?" I shouted, turning the corner toward my detached garage. There she was, Marlene Cartwright, 50-something, peroxide blonde bob, pink velour tracksuit, and the self-declared queen of our neighborhood's HOA. One hand on her hip, the other clutching a Ziploc bag stuffed with frozen chicken thighs from my garage freezer. "Oh, please," she scoffed, not even trying to hide what she was doing. "This freezer is a violation of HOA exterior conformity codes. It's visible from the alley, and that's against regulation." I blinked. "You broke into my garage to inspect my freezer?" "Don't be dramatic, Leonard. The door was unlocked." She tossed her nose in the air. "And I'm the vice president of the HOA. It's my duty to ensure compliance." I stepped closer and yanked the bag out of her hand. "First off, the door wasn't unlocked. I have footage. Second, this is private property. You don't get to just walk in and help yourself to my stuff. What the hell were you even doing in my freezer?" She rolled her eyes. "I was investigating. There have been reports of suspicious smells. Spoiled meat. It could be a health hazard." "You mean the barbecue I hosted last weekend? The one you weren't invited to?" I crossed my arms. "You're pissed because I didn't invite you, and you're reaching for a reason to harass me. You're violating Code 14, Section B," she snapped. "I'm calling the cops." "Oh, don't be ridiculous," she huffed. "No one is going to arrest a woman for checking on a potential HOA violation." But I was already walking back into the house to grab my phone. I didn't just call the police, I also pulled up the security camera feed. My garage had motion sensors, and the footage from 5 minutes ago showed her sliding under the partially open garage door like some kind of freeze-pilfering raccoon. She had gloves on. She came prepared. When the officers arrived, Marlene tried to pull the whole "I'm with the HOA" routine, but they weren't having it. "She entered my locked garage," I said, playing the footage for the officer on my front porch. "She opened my freezer and started taking food out. That's breaking and entering, and worse, she tampered with food." That caught the younger cop's attention. "Food tampering? You sure?" I nodded. "She took out raw chicken, left the lid off the cooler, and it's been sitting out in 75-degree heat for 20 minutes now. I've got kids. I'm not taking chances." Marlene, suddenly realizing this wasn't going the way she'd imagined, started backpedaling. "I was just inspecting. It's part of my job." The senior officer looked her dead in the eye. "No, ma'am. Your job doesn't involve trespassing on private property, especially not entering someone's garage and opening their freezer. That's criminal trespass and food tampering." Her face paled. "Wait. You're not seriously, you're under arrest, ma'am." Handcuffs clicked behind her back as she shrieked something about abuse of authority, and this isn't over. I just stood there, arms crossed, as the queen of the HOA was led to the squad car in front of half the neighborhood. 2 days after Marlene's arrest, a certified letter showed up, stamped with the county seal and marked official notice. I opened it at my kitchen table while my daughter, Emma, finished her cereal. Inside was a formal statement from the district attorney's office. They were pursuing criminal charges: felony food tampering and misdemeanor trespass. Apparently, tampering with consumables on private property, especially when children live there, triggered higher-level statutes in our state. I sat back slowly, rereading the first paragraph. This wasn't just a citation or some warning, it was a real case. And it wasn't going away quietly. I called my brother-in-law Craig, a municipal lawyer who had dealt with civil infractions and homeowner disputes for over a decade. He picked up on the second ring. "You sitting down?" I asked. He chuckled. "Should I be worried? Marlene's being charged with a felony." There was a pause. "You're serious?" 100%. DA's office sent paperwork. They're going forward with prosecution." "Well, that's rare. Most of these cases get buried under HOA politics or kicked back as civil matters. But a felony? That's going to hit the HOA board like a wrecking ball." Emma looked up from her bowl, spoon halfway to her mouth. "Is the chicken lady going to jail?" I nodded. "That's what the court decides." The next morning, I drove to the county courthouse to pick up the police report and request copies of the footage for the DA. As I walked into the records office, the clerk looked up and said, "You're the guy from the freezer incident, right?" I raised an eyebrow. "That well known already?" She tapped a folder. Word gets around fast when someone from the HOA gets hauled out of their house in cuffs. Here's your report. I flipped it open. The officer's statement detailed everything: Marlene's gloves, the tampered cooler, and the raw chicken she left out. But what caught my eye was an added note from the arresting officer. A previous complaint had been filed last month, anonymously, about unauthorized inspections by an HOA board member. The name wasn't listed, but the timing lined up perfectly with a neighbor down the block who'd told me his gas can had gone missing from his shed right after a surprise compliance check. I walked straight from the records office to the DA's division for property crime and requested a meeting. To my surprise, they agreed to a short sit-down. The assistant DA, a woman named Carla, met me in a conference room lined with law books and city maps. "We're pursuing this case because of the severity of the food tampering," she said, getting straight to the point. "But if there's a pattern of behavior, we're going to dig deeper." "I think there is," I said, sliding the police report across the table. "And I've got at least 2 neighbors who will talk if you ask them the right questions." She took the report without looking up. "Leave me their names. If this HOA board has been conducting unauthorized searches, or worse, it could be grounds for a broader investigation." That same night, I knocked on my neighbor Doug's door. He opened it while wiping grease off his hands with a rag. "You hear about the gas can?" "Yep. DA's office is listening now." "You still want to tell your story?" He nodded. "Damn right I do." I handed him Carla's card. The following week, a subpoena landed on Marlene's doorstep. She was out on bail, but the look on her face when it arrived was priceless. I watched from my living room window as she snatched it from the process server and slammed her door so hard it rattled the glass. Later that day, a special HOA meeting was called. An emergency session. I hadn't attended one in over a year, but this time, I made sure to show up early. The community center was packed, folding chairs full, people standing in the back, murmuring and trading glances. The other board members sat at the long table up front, looking equal parts nervous and annoyed. Bruce, the HOA president, cleared his throat and tapped the microphone. "We're here to address recent events involving our vice president. We'll keep comments civil." A voice from the back cut through the silence. "You mean the felony charge?" Bruce flinched but continued. "We've been advised not to discuss open legal matters. However, we are temporarily suspending Marlene from board duties pending the outcome of her trial." Someone near the front stood up. It was Janet, who lived 2 doors down from me. "Temporarily?" She broke into someone's garage and tampered with food. "You think we're going to trust her to come back?" Murmurs swelled into full-on chatter. "She's abused power for years," said a man near the wall. "She fined me for having a flagpole. She threatened to tow my daughter's car because her rear tire touched the sidewalk." Bruce's face turned red. "We're staying on topic." But the crowd had already turned. I stood. "I'd like to make a motion." Bruce looked like he'd swallowed a lemon. "This isn't a voting session." "Then I'll say it plainly." I turned to the room. "This board has allowed one person to harass, violate, and intimidate residents under the guise of compliance. If you think that ends with a temporary suspension, you're not listening. We need new leadership, and we need bylaws that prevent this from ever happening again." Applause broke out. Not just polite claps, full-on, standing ovation-level noise. I saw Bruce's hands tremble as he tried to quiet everyone down. After the meeting, people gathered in the parking lot. Neighbors who had never spoken before were swapping stories about fines issued without warning, inspections that seemed more like trespassing, and Marlene's habit of photographing people's yards from behind their fences. Doug pulled me aside. "You realize you just started a revolution, right?" "I didn't start it," I said. "She did when she crawled under my garage door." 2 days later, I received a call from Carla. "We've interviewed 4 residents so far. All of them described similar patterns: unauthorized entry, items moved or missing, and threats of fines when they pushed back. One even caught her trying to open a shed with a crowbar. We're opening a secondary investigation into the HOA board." I didn't respond right away. "Leonard," she said, "I'm here. Just processing. Does this mean the board's in legal trouble too? If we find evidence of complicity?" "Absolutely." By the end of the week, the community center mailbox overflowed with written complaints. Someone even started a petition to dissolve the current board. I signed it. So did over 60 other households. The court date arrived within a month. I appeared as a witness, submitted my footage, and described the full incident under oath. Doug and Janet followed with their own testimonies. The defense tried to spin it as an overzealous inspection gone wrong, but the judge wasn't buying it. Marlene was found guilty of misdemeanor trespass and felony food tampering. Sentencing was scheduled for the following month, but the judge ordered immediate removal from her HOA position and prohibited her from participating in any future neighborhood governance for at least 10 years. Bruce resigned the next morning. By that afternoon, 3 more board members had stepped down. And for the first time in years, our neighborhood felt like it actually belonged to its residents, not the people who thought they ruled it. The new HOA board elections were scheduled for the second Saturday of the month. By then, the neighborhood had transformed. Lawns were still mowed and driveways still swept, but the tension, the kind you didn't notice until it vanished, was gone. Marlene's house sat quiet, blinds drawn, a for sale sign staked in her front yard. No one waved when she passed by in her silver Lexus. And no one missed her. I wasn't planning to run. I'd done my part. But at the final candidate registration meeting, someone nominated me anyway. It was Doug. "You're the only one who stood up when the rest of us were still grumbling into our coffee," he said, dropping the form on the center table. "We don't need a politician. We need someone who knows what it's like to be on the receiving end of this garbage." I glanced at the form, then at the room. Janet, Mrs. Alvarez, and Neil from the corner lot all nodding. I didn't say yes right away, but I didn't say no either. Ballots were cast the following weekend in the community clubhouse using lockboxes borrowed from the local school district. No more anonymous board selections. No more closed-door appointments. This time it was public, transparent, fair. And when the votes were tallied, I was elected as the new HOA president by an overwhelming margin. 2 days later, I received a manila envelope from the county clerk's office. It wasn't related to the freezer debacle. This one was thicker, stapled in multiple places, and marked with a different case number. Inside were deposition transcripts, property access logs, and a list of flagged HOA citations from the past 3 years. The district attorney's office had followed through. They'd opened a full-scale investigation into the previous HOA board based on the testimonies collected during Marlene's trial. What they uncovered went far beyond frozen chicken and trespassing. There were expense reports showing inflated landscaping fees paid to a company owned by Marlene's cousin, invoices for pressure washing services that had never actually occurred, and most damning, a record of a forged signature approving the lien on a disabled veteran's home filed without due process, then retracted quietly when he hired a lawyer. I called Carla at the DA's office again. "I just received something from your office. It's bigger than I expected." Her voice was calm but deliberate. "We're filing indictments against 2 former board members. One for fraud, the other for falsifying official documents. We'll be issuing subpoenas for financial records next week." I leaned back in my chair and looked around the HOA office, still filled with outdated binders and dusty file cabinets that no one had touched since the last administration. "What do you need from me?" "Access to the HOA's internal records. And if you're able, we'd like you to support our forensic auditors when they visit the property. You'll have everything you need." That afternoon, I unlocked the filing cabinet labeled Archive 2019 and started flipping through documents. Half of it was junk, outdated newsletters and broken printer cartridges stuffed in folders, but in the last drawer, behind a stack of old meeting minutes, I found a flash drive. I plugged it into my laptop and opened the only folder on it. There were spreadsheets, names, addresses, notes with phrases like "watch for code violations" and "drive by every other week." One resident's name had a red highlight and the words "non-compliant renter" beside it. Another entry referred to retribution fees, which weren't listed in any of the official HOA bylaws. I called Carla again. "I think I just found their blacklist." She arrived the next day with 2 county investigators. One of them, a man in a windbreaker with a badge clipped to his belt, took photos of every page I printed. "This is targeted harassment," he said, flipping through the spreadsheet. They singled out specific residents, mostly renters and veterans. Carla tapped the highlighted text with a pen. "We can prove malicious intent with this. It's not just mismanagement anymore. It's criminal discrimination." They took the flash drive and left with several boxes of documents. I stayed behind, staring at the now empty cabinet. At the next HOA meeting, I laid it all out for the residents. "We've turned over all financial and internal records to the district attorney's office. Criminal charges are being filed against 2 former board members. And yes, the so-called compliance list was real. We found it. It targeted people unfairly. Someone in the front row raised a hand. What happens to the money they stole? We're working with an attorney to pursue civil recovery. If we can prove embezzlement, the HOA may be entitled to restitution. If we win, the money goes back into community projects, not the board's pockets. A quiet, older woman near the wall stood up. I recognized her from the edge of the neighborhood, lived in the old brick house with the ivy-covered fence. My husband and I were fined over $800 in 2 years. We never knew why. They said it was 4 yard violations. But we pay for a gardener. She sat back down slowly. I met her gaze. You're not the only one. We're going to fix this. By the following month, the forensic audit was complete. The HOA had lost over $30,000 to fraudulent contracts. The DA's office filed felony theft charges against the former treasurer, a man named Curtis Bell, who had quietly resigned 6 months before Marlene's arrest. He'd been funneling duplicate payments through a shell landscaping company registered to a P.O. box in another county. The second person charged was none other than Bruce, the former HOA president. His charge? Falsifying lien authorizations and forging electronic signatures. The veteran whose home he had nearly taken came to the courthouse to watch him get arraigned. I went too. Bruce avoided looking at anyone as he entered the courtroom, his shoulders hunched like he was trying to disappear inside his own jacket. The judge didn't offer any leniency. Bail was set high, and the case was labeled high priority due to the number of victims involved. Back in the neighborhood, things started to shift. People who'd once avoided HOA meetings were now volunteering on committees. Janet helped organize a community garden in the empty lot behind the clubhouse. Doug headed a review panel ensuring fines required photographic evidence and 2 board member approvals. The new treasurer, a retired bookkeeper named Phil, posted monthly financial summaries on a public bulletin board outside the clubhouse doors. We rewrote the bylaws. Every single one. Gone were the vague clauses about aesthetic conformity and subjective harmony. In their place were clear, measurable rules with built-in resident appeals and third-party mediation. And I made one final change. We installed a permanent camera in the HOA office. Not because I expected trouble, but because no one should ever have to rely on luck and a garage security feed to protect their rights. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the rooftops, I stood on my driveway and listened. Kids were riding scooters. Someone was grilling. Neighborhood chatter floated on the breeze. Emma ran up with a piece of chalk, her hands covered in dust. Dad, come see what we drew. She led me to the sidewalk where she and a few other kids had drawn a big, lopsided smiley face surrounded by flowers and stars. In the center, in big block letters, was the word free. I crouched down beside her and nodded. That's perfect. Because for the first time in years, that's exactly what it felt like. The air was crisper than usual that morning. Fall had settled in, and with it came the kind of clarity that only arrives after a storm. I'd spent the last few weeks buried in paperwork, HOA reform proposals, community feedback forms, and the final audit reports, but today was different. Today was about closure. I pulled into the county courthouse parking lot just after 8. The sun was still low, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. This wasn't about Marlene anymore. Her sentencing had been handled swiftly, her case closed with a conviction that carried a suspended sentence and a mandatory restitution order. But what remained lingering in the background, like a splinter under the skin, was the matter of the fraudulent liens filed by the former board. Inside courtroom 6, quiet tension filled the air. Bruce sat at the defense table beside his attorney, avoiding eye contact with every person in the gallery. The veteran whose home he'd nearly taken, a man named Harold Gentry, sat 3 rows behind me with his wife. She held his hand tightly, her eyes fixed forward like she was willing the entire trial to collapse under its own weight. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Dorsey, stepped forward and began her opening statement. We are here today because a board entrusted with fiduciary duty weaponized that trust against its own residents. Mr. Bruce Langley knowingly falsified records to initiate property liens without legal review, due process, or resident notification. This wasn't a clerical error. It was a calculated abuse of power, and today, we will prove that. Bruce's lawyer tried a different tack, painting him as overwhelmed, misled by Marlene, and unaware of the implications of his actions. But the emails told a different story. Dorsey displayed a printed chain on the screen, each one time-stamped, each one showing knowledge, intent, and direction. One line stood out. Push it through before he hires counsel. We'll settle later if we have to. That wasn't the voice of someone confused. That was someone who thought he wouldn't get caught. After the prosecution presented its case, Harold was called to the stand. He adjusted his tie, cleared his throat, and spoke with the calm of a man who knew exactly what had been taken from him, even if it hadn't been his house. I served in 2 tours overseas. When I came back, all I wanted was peace. My wife and I bought that house because we thought we'd earned it. And then, one day, we got a notice that our property was under lien. No explanation. No warning. Just a threat that if we didn't pay, we'd lose our home. He didn't cry. But the silence afterward was heavier than shouting. The next witness was a local notary public, who testified that her digital stamp had been forged on 3 separate lien authorizations. She'd never met Bruce, never notarized anything for the HOA, and had filed a police report herself once she learned her credentials had been compromised. It took the jury less than 2 hours to reach a verdict. Guilty on 2 counts of fraud, 1 count of forgery, and 1 count of unlawful lien filing under the state's Enhanced Property Protection Statute. The judge ordered immediate remand into custody pending sentencing. As Bruce was led away by the bailiff, his eyes finally met mine. There was no anger, no denial. Just that hollow, sinking look of someone who had finally run out of excuses. Back in the neighborhood, things didn't erupt into celebration. There were no fireworks or victory speeches, just quiet acknowledgement that something wrong had been righted. Janet stopped by my driveway later that evening with a clipboard. We finalized the proposal for the Community Oversight Committee. We want 3 resident elected members to oversee all future board activity. No more closed-door decisions. I signed it without hesitation. The following week, I met with a city councilwoman who had taken interest in our case. Her office was exploring legislation to require mandatory training for all HOA board members across the county, including ethics standards and financial transparency protocols. She'd heard what happened through the grapevine and wanted to use it as a catalyst. If it happened in your neighborhood, she said, it's probably happened in others. You just had the right storm of evidence to expose it. I offered to testify during the hearing. Not because I wanted recognition, but because I knew silence is what let people like Marlene and Bruce operate for as long as they did. The hearing took place at City Hall, where a panel of council members listened as I laid out exactly how it had all unfolded from a freezer inspection turned felony arrest to a forged lien that nearly cost a veteran his home. I presented documentation, including the recovered blacklist spreadsheet, and recommended mandatory third-party audits for all HOA boards over 50 homes. One councilman leaned forward. This is the most detailed account we've received. Why do you think no one came forward sooner? I didn't hesitate. Because people were afraid. The board controlled home values, fines, access to amenities. They used that power to silence dissent. We need protections for residents, not just rules for boards. The city passed the ordinance unanimously. Back home, the neighborhood was quieter than I could remember. Not empty, just at ease. Kids still played in the yards, but now parents lounged nearby with coffee instead of watching the street for the next citation. The new HOA board published its first quarterly report in full, with every expenditure broken down to the cent. People actually read it. Emma came home from school with a note about an art contest for the neighborhood newsletter. Her drawing, selected as the cover, showed a house with bright windows and people smiling on the porch. In the corner, a small sign read, "Welcome all." We framed it and hung it in the HOA office. I stepped down as president at the end of my term. It felt right to hand off the reins to someone new, someone who hadn't had to drag the truth out by force. Phil took over calm, methodical, and unshakably fair. His first act was to install a suggestion box that actually got checked. I still attended meetings, but now I sat in the back, arms folded, watching others speak up without fear. Doug ran the community barbecue that spring, and Harold led a Memorial Day event at the clubhouse, telling stories of his service while children placed flags in the flower beds. Marlene never returned to the neighborhood. Her house sold quietly to a young couple with a rescue dog and a tomato garden. They never asked what happened before they moved in. And we didn't tell them, not because we were hiding it, but because it no longer defined us. What happened had changed our neighborhood, but not in the way Marlene or Bruce had intended. We had rebuilt, rule by rule, from the ashes of their arrogance. We had turned fear into action, silence into testimony, and a petty abuse of power into a catalyst for reform that reached beyond our block. And in the end, It all started with a garage freezer. Funny how justice sometimes comes chilled.